So today, I want to do something that that we really started a couple weeks ago, and I would have done it last week, but I couldn't be here. And I watched online. Greg did a great job, didn't he? Can you imagine putting that together with one day's notice? I mean, that was like wow. It was amazing. Yeah. So, so we're already talking about like, what about next time? 'Cause hopefully, it never happens like that again. But we're gonna go back to where we were, and in Daniel, and I just want to read just a small section of the chapter, just to kind of get us back in the mindset of where we're at. So in Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14. The scripture says, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels of burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. So this passage is obviously this where we get this phrase, the Son of Man, from. And last time when we met, when I was here, we talked about the phrase, Son of Man. And I actually presented to you a chapter, not all of it, but excerpts from a chapter. I gave you the whole chapter from a book by Daniel Bayarin called The Jewish Gospels, chapter 2, and we went through that, and I showed you some remarkable thoughts by this guy. So that book it's actually a readable book. You saw that. He wrote another book called Borderlines. Now, the book Borderlines, two different words, you can see in that one handout you got, was a book that he wrote 8 years earlier, and it's about the developing of the lines between Judaism and Christianity. Has anybody here read that? Nathaniel's read it. It's a challenging read. It's readable, but it's a challenging read. And it's a fascinating book, and he just explains how it actually took 6 centuries before Judaism and Christianity could actually be considered separate, distinct religions. And what's interesting about that is the guy's a traditional Jew. He's not a messianic. He doesn't believe that Jesus is who we all believe Jesus to be. But he says it took 6 centuries. So for that long, Judaism and Christianity was a sect within Judaism. So Borderlines is about the development of the lines between the two faiths and how that happened and what was the process from the mind of a person who doesn't believe that Jesus is who we believe him to be. And so while I was at the King's working on my degree there, we did read Borderlines, and I had to write a paper not only on that, but on that book, but I also had to write another paper on surprises and things that I learned in that course. And I included a section on Daniel Bayarin's material. So what I've given to you today that I'm going to share with you is actually an excerpt from a paper that I wrote back in 2000, probably 12, maybe 11, 2011 probably, on the book Borderlines. And so I thought it relates to this whole idea of the Son of Man and what Daniel Byron says about this second person who we believe, what he'll call binitarianism. And so I'm just going to read this to you, comment on it as I read it, and it's really just about what Daniel Byron said, but I think you'll find it interesting, and the reason I think that is based upon how you responded last time I talked. So I think you'll find it interesting. It's the long handout. It says, "This is part of a paper that I wrote during my studies at the King's University." You all got that? Some don't have it. How many don't have it? Mel? Can someone help? Thank you. And I apologize. It's on the table, yeah. Huh? We're out. Could you share the link and let people pull it up on their phones? I apologize. But I'll read it, and I'll do like I do when I read something, and so I think you'll be okay following along. But it would be better if you had it, just as you know. But here we go. Byron's presentation of the Lesser Adonai begs the question. So, as you will remember from what we talked about last time, he makes the point that in Judaism, by the time that Yeshua is walking the earth, there is this perspective within Judaism that he will say most Jews have. He actually doesn't say many. He says most Jews believe that there is a greater, what he will call the greater Adonai and the lesser Adonai. Yud He Vav He. The greater one and the lesser one. And that this view that there was actually two persons in the singular God. Now we can understand three Trinitarians. But from a Jewish perspective, if you don't believe when you come to the place where you accept the idea that there is a second person in God, it's an easy step to go to the third. That's not an issue at all. The issue for a Jewish person is to come to the place where you will realize that there could be a second. And what he makes the point in his book is that there's actually most Jews, when Jesus is walking the earth, believe that there is two people in the Godhead, if you will. And he uses the word binitarianism. In fact, in the other handout that you have, at the top of it, I give a little definition. Binitarianism is the belief in a two-part God. By way of explanation, Trinitarians believe in a three-part God, and we'll come back to that in a moment, that sheet. Going back over to the longer handout that we're talking about. Byron's presentation of the lesser Yahweh begs the question. If the first and second century Jews were accepting of the lesser Adonai, can their documents be used evangelistically among Jews? Is it actually possible to preach Jesus as the Messiah from the Talmud? In his book Borderlines, Byron calls attention to a binitarian form of Judaism. Byron indicates that this dualistic concept of divinity, you understand what I mean by a dualistic concept of divinity? This idea that God has got two parts. Okay? So he indicates that this dualistic concept of divinity is, quote, quite early but post-Christian. So that's what he says in the book Borderlines. He says that this idea that God is two-part, he says, is very early in Judaism, but post-Christian. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, you got the distinct impression that that's not so how could that be? And that's the point of this other handout. So on this other handout, you have two books here. Now, I realize the paper I've been reading to you from is a book critique that was written probably about 2011, because I started at the King's in 2010. Okay? So I would have written that book, this book critique that we're reading from, well, Borderlines was out, but the Jewish Gospels was not printed yet. So what you see on this page here is his development and how he went from thinking one thing to thinking something else. So let's look at this paper for just real briefly. Like, first of all, in Borderlines, he will make this statement. The bottom book, Borderlines. Moshe Idel uses the term binitarian for this Jewish form of Jewish prayer. This form of Jewish prayer may be as early as the late 2nd century, and at the latest is from the 4th or 5th century. And then he writes, it becomes harder and harder to see binitarian worship as distinguishing Judaism from Christianity. So in 2004, he's thinking, it's really hard for me to see this, that there's two different ways of looking at, Christianity's multiple persons in the one God, and Judaism's the one. And he says, it's getting harder and harder for me to say that that's really the difference between Judaism and Christianity. He goes on to say, as Idel emphasizes, this binitarian prayer was found in absolutely central, early, medieval rabbinic writers. You're talking what, 12th century, 13th century? That's like way after Jesus. Okay? Absolutely central, early medieval rabbinic writers of whom it is almost impossible to imagine that they invented a binitarian worship form that they had not received as a tradition. So he writes, it's getting really hard for me to say that this is the difference. He writes that in 2004. But by the time he comes out with this book in 2012, he's done more research, and this is his conclusion. The idea of a second God as viceroy to God the Father is one of the oldest of theological ideas in Israel. And that's where you saw that whole chapter when we met 2 weeks ago. He has completely thrown away the idea by the time he gets to the Jewish Gospels. He has thrown it out. The idea that this distinction between Judaism and Christianity back then was this idea of 1 versus 2. He says, I was struggling with it. I'm not struggling with it now. That's just one of the oldest ideas in Judaism. That's his material. So now I'm commenting. We're going to go back to my paper now, and I'm commenting on the bottom book, okay, the Borderlines. Excuse me. According to Bayarin, the concept of two powers in heaven is something promoted by a min. Now, a min is a word that he will use throughout his material, and it's used in the Talmud to describe anybody who's like a heretic. So he's still not there where he's thinking everybody, this was normal. They're heretics, but he will not use the word heretic the way we as Christians will use the word heretic. In Judaism, and especially with him, the heretic or the min doesn't mean it doesn't mean you're a Jehovah's Witness. It means you're the minority. You're not like the main guy. Like, yeah, they believe there's some people out there. Okay, that's the min. Okay, think minority. According to Bayarin, the concept of two powers in heaven is something promoted by a min, otherwise known as an apostate Jew. Recognizing that the second power in heaven was rejected by the Jews of the first 2 centuries does not erase it from Jewish history. What I'm saying is, okay, they may have rejected it, but it's still in Jewish history. So I'm commenting on what he said. It's still there. Judaism uses different names for the second power in heaven. He is referred to as the Lesser Adonai, the Logos, the Memra, Sophia, and Metatron. Jews saw him referenced in Daniel as the Son of Man. And you saw that last week. Jewish people, scholars, see this phrase, Son of Man, as something that's referring to somebody who's divinity. And it's a favorite self-designation of Jesus in the gospel. The fact that Jews found the lesser Adonai in the early writings of Moses is especially interesting. According to the Talmudic Midrash, what's a Midrash? A Midrash is a teaching. Okay, it's like, anything that's a teaching is a Midrash. Some of it's good, some of it's loony, but some of it's very good. Okay, so according to a Talmudic Midrash, on Exodus 23, Adonai wanted Israel to relate to the angel that Adonai would send with his people. Apparently, the angel that God sent with his people in the desert was a different person from Adonai himself. Exodus 23:20. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way, to bring you into the place which I have prepared. So he's saying, I'm sending this angel. Evidently, that is a distinct person. Going over to page 2. God indicates that his name is in the angel. Since this angel bears the name of Adonai, he shares the identity of Adonai in some respects. The angel is in fact called by the name Adonai. Beware of him, Exodus 23:21, and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. So God says there's this angel in Exodus 23:20. We're not even talking Talmud now. We're talking Torah. There is this angel, and my name is in him. Now, the most identifying characteristic of any being is their name. Okay? I could gain 100 pounds, I would still be Greg. I could lose 30 pounds, I'd still be Greg. I could go through surgery and have a leg removed, I'd still be Greg. No matter what you do, I'm still Greg. When God wanted to change somebody's identity, he would change their name from Jacob to Israel. Your name is your most identified. There's nothing that identifies you more than your name. God takes names upon himself for the purpose of showing people who he really is. So what God is saying in Exodus 23:21, there is an angel, and he is called by my name. That's a pretty strong statement. Okay? On the other hand, I go on with the paper. The angel is distinct from Adonai, for Adonai sends him. Another unique quality of this angel is that he has the power to forgive sins, a privilege that belongs to Adonai. The notion that the Son of God, Jesus, should have the power to forgive sin is not new for Christians. However, the notion that most of Judaism during the early centuries of the church believe in a binatarian God is new and exciting to many in today's Gentile church. Now, you will notice I said the notion that most of Judaism. So I didn't give the page number there, but I can tell you the page. He will say on page 92 and page 120. He will say, he does not use the word many. He does not use a lot. He will say most Jews in the first century believed in a binatarian God. In other words, if you didn't, you were in the minority. And that is in the earlier book, Borderlines, which is very interesting. Byron does an excellent job explaining how the concept of the Logos was used by both Jews and Christians as they defined themselves. While the Christians said, we are the ones who believe in the Logos, the Jews were saying we are different from those Christians. And one of the ways that we are different is that we do not accept binatarianism. Before I read on, here's essentially what he says in his book. In the very first century, the church, as it was forming, and Judaism, because the church wasn't even formed yet, Judaism, as it were, was going through this inner civil war. And there were Jews who were saying, I am among the Jews who believe in a second person in the Godhead, binatarianism. Other Jews were saying, no, 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 I'm among those who don't. And so Daniel Bayarin says that's John the Gospel's point when he writes, in the beginning was the Word. The word for word is logos. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. So what John is doing, according to Daniel Bayarin, a traditional Jew, not a Messianic Jew, is Daniel Bayarin is saying, hey, I'm one of those Jews that believe in this two-part Godhead. And Daniel Bayarin directly says that as there were these borderlines forming between Judaism and Christianity, the first border incident was over this one issue right here. Are you one of those Jews who believe that God actually has two people in the Godhead? That was the first, according to Daniel Bayarin. So, going back to the paper, many in the church would find this interesting, and such familiarity can only equip Christians to evangelize Jews. You can see why. It's in your heritage to believe in more than one. It's in your Torah. It's in Exodus 23, 20 and 21. Bayarin says, quote, Metatron may indeed be the figure in non-Christian Jewish myth who is most closely related to Jesus. This person, Metatron. That seems like to look a lot like Jesus. He says, but Christians don't worship Metatron. They worship Jesus. The Jewish men, that is the smaller group, the Jewish men, however, like Christians, is binitarian. This smaller group of Jews, just like the Christians of the year 2025, they're binitarian, except we're Trinitarian, who holds that the angelic vice-regent Metatron is to be worshipped. Could it be that Bayarin is failing to adequately appreciate the concept of prophetic foreshadowing? Could some of the Talmudic writings about Metatron be similar in nature to what modern Pentecostals call prophecy? This is not to say that the Talmudic Jews who recognize the lesser Adonai wrote Holy Scripture, far from it. However, could it be that some of the Talmudic rabbis were led of the Spirit to acknowledge the existence of a lesser Adonai? Were some of the writers of the Talmud actually doing that, is the question that I'm raising, having read Bayarin. It is worth considering those Talmudic visions. So in this paper, I'm talking about what I'm going to do in this paper now. First, in this paper, we will consider the various names of the second person in the Godhead as Bayarin identified them. More time will be given in this paper to the name Metatron in light of Bayarin's observation that, quote, Metatron may indeed be the figure that a non-Christian Jewish myth who is most closely related to Jesus. So what I do on the rest of page 3 is I just begin to go through the other names. I'm not going to do that with you here today. Okay, but you can read it. And I just go through them, the other names that he said. I mentioned Sophia. I mentioned Memra. Going over to page 4. Because the name that is in the Talmud that is the most interesting to me, and I think to us who are interested in this question, can the Talmud actually be seen to present Jesus? This name Metatron becomes interesting. Top of page 4. So what does the Talmud say about Metatron? The Metatron is mentioned in only 3 places in the Talmud. So Hag, Hagia, is a tract, one of the 63 books of the Talmud. So Hagia 15a, Sanhedrin 38b, and Avodah Zarah 3b. Those 3 passages in the Talmud will use this word Metatron, and what I'm going to do is actually give them in the paper and explain, isn't this kind of interesting the way it puts it? Okay. Could these texts be used to establish Jesus as the lesser Adonai? First, Metatron is mentioned in Hagia. Okay. Archer, it's a guy in the Talmud, cuts the plants. It is of him that Scripture says, suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. And then it asks the question, what is Ecclesiastes 5 verse 2 and Ecclesiastes 5 verse 6 referring to? He saw the Metatron. So the Talmud is saying, this guy Archer saw the Metatron, to whom is given permission to sit to record the merits of Israel. He said, that is, Archer said, we are taught that in heaven there is no sitting down, nor anger, nor back, nor weariness. This idea of no back, how many of you have been to the wall in Israel, the Western Wall? A lot of you. Have you noticed that there are a lot of people who will not turn their back when they walk away from the wall? Right? There you go. So that's kind of, here's the part of that tradition right there. So as you don't give God your back. Okay? So he says, we're taught that in the heavens there's no sitting down. You don't sit in God's presence. Nor anger, nor back, nor weariness. Now this is Talmud. David sat in the presence of God. Okay? So not everything in the Talmud is God. Okay? But it's still very interesting. Okay? Are there, God forbid, two first principles, he asks? So let me just explain what is this idea of a first principle. Let's say I drop this lighter. And so the lighter goes and it hits the floor. Okay, why did the lighter hit the floor? Because I dropped it. But where did I come from? My mother. Where'd she come from? And you just keep going back, and you keep going back, and eventually you come to the first principle. Where'd the Big Bang come from? And so the Talmud is asking the question here, are there, God forbid, two first principles? Are there two who have always been? Always been. We'll address this when we get back to the longer handout, which we may not get to today, because I'm taking more time here than I thought I would. Then it goes on to say, they brought out the Metatron and gave him 60 strokes with a lash of fire. They said to him, what is the reason that when thou sawest him, thou did not rise up before him? So he's asking the question, how could you not stand in the presence of God? How do you do that? If you go in Israel, in the Western Wall, on the male side, there's a female side and a male side. On the male side, there's an under the kind of area called the Torah Ark Room. Anybody been in there? I know Greg's been in there. You couldn't have been there, Grisha. It's on the man's side. Anybody else been there? Yeah, you've seen my pictures. So if you're in the Torah Ark Room and they open the arks, the men stand up. It's air conditioned too. Yeah, the men stand up. You stand up. Okay? So they're saying, how could you not stand up? This is a scene in heaven. This guy is in heaven. He's sitting in front of God, and he's writing, and he's not standing in God's presence. And he gets whipped with 60 lashes. That's the picture in the Talmud there. So apparently, I go on to say, Haggidah relates that Elisha ben Abuya, that is Archer, experienced a heavenly visitation. When Archer saw Metatron sitting in Adonai's presence in heaven, Archer was temporarily convinced that Metatron was a second deity. But seeing Metatron punished with 60 lashes convinced Elisha that Metatron could not possibly be deity. Could it be, this is just me asking the question here, could it be that Elisha's vision was actually correct? Could it be that Metatron was able to sit in the presence of the Almighty because the Metatron is deity? Could it be that the stripes which Metatron received were actually a prophetic vision of Jesus' passion? Could it be that Elisha had a vision similar to Isaiah 53? Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. That's kind of really interesting. Page 5. Is Metatron the Word, the Logos of God, as he is seated at the Father's right hand? Could this vision be a depiction of the Son of God leaving his exalted position to receive the stripes by which we are healed? The second place that Metatron is mentioned in the Talmud is in the tract called Sanhedrin, tract 38b. So Naaman said, Rabbi Naaman, he who is skilled in refuting the minim is plural of min. He was skilled in refuting the minim, as Rabbi Adith said, let him do so, but not otherwise. Once a mid said to Adith, it is written, and unto Moses he said, come up to the Lord. But surely it should have stated, come up to me. We're going to look at that in a moment in the paper. The Torah says that God says, come up to the Lord. Why does he not say, come up to me? It was Metatron, the Talmud goes on to say, who said that. He replied, whose name is similar to that of his master, for it is written, my name is in him. But if so, he retorted, we should worship him. The same passage, however, replied Rabbi Edith, says, be not rebellious against him. That is, exchange me not for him. But if so, why is it stated he will not pardon your transgression? He answered, by our troth, in other words, by our truth, we would not accept him even as a messenger, for it is written, and he said unto him, if thy personal presence go not, etc. So that above tractate, I'm going to turn I think my phone needs to be silenced. Okay, that above tractate in Sanhedrin is a midrash, a teaching on the Torah in Exodus 24, verse 1. Exodus 24, verse 1 says this. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 7 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance. Now the men in the Sanhedrin, 38b passage, is arguing that it is noteworthy that the Lord did not say, Moses, come up to me. The Talmud saying this is like significant. He's not saying, Moses, come up to me. Okay? After all, it is the Lord who's speaking to Moses. In Sanhedrin 38b, it says that it is not Adonai who is speaking in Exodus 24:1. Rather, it is Metatron who is speaking to Moses. However, it is possible that the person speaking in Exodus 24:1 is Adonai. And my point here is Exodus 24:1 is Yahweh, and Jesus is using similar logic when he himself quotes Psalm 110. The Lord said unto my Lord. God said to Moses, come up to me. There seem to be two different people in the Godhead there. Can you see that? The Lord said, not unto me. The Lord said, come up, or God said, come up to the Lord. That's two different people, which is the same logic now that Psalm 110 is using. The Lord, and Jesus is quoting this. He's explaining who he is. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, till I make your enemies my footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he then his son? And no one was able to answer him a word from that day on. Did anyone dare to question him anymore? So it just looks like you've got the same logic. Jesus is using the exact same logic that you find in Matthew 22, because he's quoting Psalm 110, but he's using the same logic that's found in Exodus 24.
You've seen this midrash predates
I don't know that it predates it because the Talmud is not necessary. The Talmud is written post Jesus, but it's clearly in Jewish writing. So the point is, if you're a rabbi who believes that the Talmud is the oral law, your book says this. Does it predate Jesus? Probably not. Everybody got that? According to the Talmud, Metatron is the angel of Exodus 23. So you're just kind of really like, you're really pressed with this. Like it seems to really be, there's something there. Please. Okay, so we are talking that. Yeah, the question is, so we've been told that the angel Lord is Jesus. We believe that. And you're asking, is that who we're talking about here? We're going to say as followers who worship Yeshua as part of the Trinity, yes, the angel Lord is certainly in the Old Testament, it's almost always got to be Jesus. Okay? There might be some exceptions where it might not be. And in the New Testament, it may not be at all. Okay? But in the Old Testament, you're really stuck with that. Like the angel of the Lord, Exodus 23, verses 20 and 21. God says, I'm sending my angel. And there's a lot of other verses where we've seen that in here. But if you asked a Jew this, literally, if you just went to a Jewish person and said, do you believe this? They're going to struggle with that. So it's a good question. Okay, bottom of page 5. Finally, it is interesting that the gloss, and let me tell you what the gloss is like. Okay, so you have the Talmud, 63 tractates. The Talmud is basically take the Mishnah. Mishnah is not Midrash. Don't confuse those two words. Very different. Okay? Midrash is just any teaching. Could be cuckoo stuff, could be good. Midrash. Okay? Mishnah is the core of the Talmud. Okay, so what is the Talmud? The Talmud is, if you opened up a tractate or a book of the Talmud, in the middle of the page you would see this writing in the middle of the page, and that's the Mishnah. And then all around the Mishnah is this other stuff in the Talmud. This is everything on the page, everything I'm describing is Talmud. All this other stuff is comments on what's in the Mishnah. This is all gloss. And this is Mishnah. That's really how you can get the picture here. So page 5 at the bottom. The Talmud, when Jews talk about the oral law, they mean the Talmud. And Orthodox Jews will pretty quick, not all of them, but most of them will quickly admit, very quickly, even offer it on their own, saying, we are not biblically observant, we are Talmudically observant. That's Jewish thinking. So they Orthodox Jew will put the Talmud on a par with the written Torah. And they will put it on a par, but they will not, for example, put the book of Daniel on that par. So it's like the Talmud is the oral law, given by God out Mount Sinai, according to Orthodox thinking. Yeah, let me just give a word. It's easy for us to see problems with the Talmud, and we can. But I want you to imagine that it's 1,000 years from now, and the Lord has not returned. I know that's not going to happen, but if it did, pick your absolute favorite book. If you could only identify one book that has been written in the past 100 years, just one. Of all the Christian books you've read, if you could identify just one, what would be the best book you could identify, you personally? Here's my thought on that. Why would you necessarily think more highly of that book than you would of the Talmud? Because you won't think that way of that book 1,000 years from now if the Lord hasn't returned. Go back 1,000 years and look at some of the things that the church honored as though it was the Word of God. And there's a lot of really good stuff in it, and we should be reading it. But those books that we're honoring now, they don't belong in the Bible. They don't. The best book you could possibly name, it don't belong in the Bible. The Talmud does not belong in the Bible. But how easily we just throw that aside when actually this is written by people who are living a lot closer to the Bible than we do. So I'm very slow to just throw it out. So my view on, forget about the whole Jewish thing for a moment. You're considering where you're going to go to church. So you visit some church, and you ask yourself two questions. And these questions will determine whether or not you're going to go to that church. You're going to ask yourself, what they're preaching, is it biblical? And what they're preaching, does it exalt Jesus? And if you come up with a no to either question, you will not go to that church. And my contention is those same exact two filters should be used for all things Jewish. What Judaism preaches, is it biblical? And most of the time it is. And many times it's far more biblical than what the church preaches. And does it exalt Jesus? And if you will use those two filters for all things Jewish, if it doesn't exalt Jesus, if it's not biblical, but if it does those two things, my contention is what I have found is you will find 10,000 things that Judaism got right that the church got wrong. And you will find, but you'll find the one thing, the big kahuna, that the church got right and the church and Judaism got wrong in terms of Judaism today. And that's, who is Jesus? So when you take the things of Judaism and the things of the church and you bring them together, you walk into this place of immense wealth because you're getting things that the church is just blind to. They don't get it. And you see that because studying the Torah, studying Jewish stuff. But Jesus is Jesus. And you don't throw the big kahuna out for, I don't care, 10,000 other things. But those 10,000 other things will take your understanding of Jesus to a whole nother level. Did you have something, Kristen? Layers of what? Erroneous theology. Yeah, because we build things on, we tend to build things on previous church theology, and there's a lot of good in there. There is. But it isn't the same as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's not, forget about church theology, forget about Jewish theology. That's the Bible. It's the Bible. It says it. That's where we go, right? And I've said this before. Maybe it's been a little while since I've said it, but I have no problem throwing away any tradition based upon what the Bible says. None at all. But you better give me good reason to throw that tradition out, including church tradition. Like I tend to fall on crucifixion on a Friday. Tend to. Why? There are people who are smarter than me that will go with Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And all of them will disagree with each other. You better give me some good Bible for throwing away a tradition that has existed for 2,000 years within the church. But if you give me some Bible, I'll go there. See what I mean? You got to give me Bible. Give me Bible, that's it. That's all. There's nothing else. Okay? But I am going to go, but church tradition matters to me. It really does matter. Okay? And there are questions with Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They all have questions. And so they're good questions. All of them. All right, let's go back to this paper. So on the bottom of page 5, finally, it is interesting that the gloss on Sanhedrin 38 points out that, page 6, the numerical value of Metatron is the same as that of the Shaddai, El Shaddai, which is, if you're Gematria, if you're in Esther's class on Hebrew, you know what I'm talking about. And we've talked about it as well in here. That's kind of interesting that that happens. Apparently, the Talmudic rabbis recognized the theological problem was not so easily dismissed. Sanhedrin 38 quotes Exodus 38:21. Pay attention to him. Listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion since my name is in him. The plain reading of Exodus 23:21 is that the angel, who has the name of Adonai in him, has the power to forgive sin. Sanhedrin 38 recognizes the dilemma with their phrase, by our troth, or literally, we hold the belief. So could it be that Sanhedrin 38 tract actually supports binatarianism? The third place the Talmud mentions Metatron is in Avodah Zarah, which says, what then does God do in the fourth quarter? Now, before I read on, what is the fourth quarter? In Jewish thinking, the day is broken up into 4 quarters, time. And so there's some interesting things you could look online about that. You know, what does God do during the fourth quarter of the day? That's kind of a fun thing to read about. Okay, a couple of things it says. It says he plays with Leviathan on the fourth quarter. See, this is what I mean by Judaism has, how many angels can dance on the head of a needle? That's the church. Okay. Well, in Judaism, he plays with Leviathan in the fourth quarter. And also in the fourth quarter of the day, he sustains the world. So it's talking about that kind of thinking. What then does God do in the fourth quarter? He sits and instructs school children. As it is said, whom shall one teach knowledge? And whom shall one make to understand the message? Them that are weaned from milk. Now that's an interesting phrase we're going to come to. What is God doing in this fourth quarter of time every day? He's instructing children who have been weaned from milk. Who instructed them, therefore? If you like, you may say Metatron. It's Metatron who's instructing the children, according to the Talmud. Or maybe he said that God did this as well as other things. So it seems to be saying they're both doing it. It seems to be identifying the two as one. So the phrase asks the question, who will teach? The passage suggests that Metatron will be the one doing the teaching. Now, other than the cross, Jesus' primary earthly ministry was teaching. However, the phrase weaned by milk is interesting in light of its connection with the messianic passage found in Isaiah 7, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey. What's curds? It's milk that has turned into cottage cheese, essentially. Curds and honey he shall eat, and he may know how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know how to refuse the evil and choose good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. So it shall be, from the abundance of milk they give, that he will eat curds. For curds and honey everyone will eat who is left in the land. Page 7. The sign being promised in Isaiah 7 is a sign to more people than just King Ahaz. Because remember, Isaiah says, ask for a sign. That's the point of the passage in Isaiah 7. But it's a sign to more people than just King Ahaz, because the word you in Isaiah 7:14 is in the plural. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign, not singular, plural. So he's saying, I'm going to give a sign to more than one. It's spoken to God's people. And the sign is that God is going to be with Israel, as the name Emmanuel means God with us. So this passage in Isaiah 7, we all understand, is very messianic. The messianic promise of Isaiah 7:14 describes a boy, as he grows, is weaned from wrong to right. Now, obviously, there's an issue here. This can't be Jesus. But nevertheless, just stick with it. Okay, weaned from wrong to right. Both Isaiah 7 and Avodah Zarah use the metaphor of dairy. Admittedly, the phrase is not used the same way in Isaiah 7 and in Avodah Zarah. Nevertheless, it would seem an obvious admission. Actually, I should use the word omission. It would seem to be an obvious omission if I, the writer of this paper, failed to identify the fact that both Isaiah 7 and Avodah Zarah are using the same metaphor. How could I not mention this? And the word Metatron only appears 3 times. So I can't just ignore it. It's there. It would seem an obvious omission if I, the writer, failed to identify the fact that both Isaiah 7 and Avodah Zarah are using similar metaphors, albeit in different ways. This is especially significant since the other 2 times Metatron is mentioned by the Talmud could be used to endorse binitarianism. It is not beyond reason to argue that the Lesser Adonai was clearly seen in Metatron. The Karaites were a Jewish sect that came into existence around the 8th or the 9th century. They denied the rabbinic tradition because they felt that rabbis had been too open to dualism and had not supported monotheism strongly enough. So a lot of modern in the church and in Judaism, especially Messianic Jews, like to brag about the Karaites and think good about them. And why? Because they say the rabbinic authority is worthless. You got to go with the Bible. But what I'm pointing out here is they also said the rabbis are not monotheistic enough. So be a little careful when you're jumping on the Karaite bandwagon. Okay? Okay, so apparently as late as the 9th century, that's a long time after Jesus. Apparently as late as the 9th century, the debate over the Lesser Adonai was significant enough to call into question the essence of a rabbinic authority. In other words, the Karaites arose because they were angry with the rest of the rabbis because they're not monotheistic enough. So the whole Karaite movement started because of binitarianism. That is kind of interesting. This is a millennium after the fact. That being said, it seems reasonable to raise the question today. Only this time, the author, that is me, is raising the question in support of binitarianism. While the Metatron can be seen as part of a dualistic God, he is also seen as the Lesser Adonai. Jesus presented himself as one with the Father and also as the Lesser Adonai. I and my Father are one. That makes him Adonai. My Father is greater than I. That makes him the Lesser Adonai. Is it possible then to preach Jesus as the Lesser Adonai from the Talmud, based on the 3 passages where the Metatron is actually presented in the Talmud? The answer seems to be yes.